So welcome everybody to another episode of the Project Management for UX series. My name is Itamar Medeiros. I'm originally from Brazil, but I'm currently living in Germany for the last 10 years. My background is graphic design, but for the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of design management, user experience design. And what we are talking in this series is what are the skills that designers need to be more efficient when delivering projects related to UX. And I'll argue that these skills are not just for UX, but basically anybody working on the team that wants to make sure that we are all pedaling in the same direction. So this is the last episode of a five-part series on project management where we cover these core 5 skills. Provide vision and direction, coach and mentor team members, negotiation, issue and conflict resolution, effective decision making, and today we're going to be talking about communication and stakeholder management. If you're wondering why these 5 skills, basically we've been going over this in every part of this series. These 5 skills are the core skills that the Project Management Institute, or PMI, recommends that project managers have if they want to be effective with project management. You might not have the title of project manager in your project, but my experience proves that if you don't have the title and the team is struggling with, then why don't you just step up to the plate and help the team get untangled? And we've been talking about every piece of the series that because designers tend to be the role that is not core responsible for the execution, right? That we get to be very active during pieces of the development process when we are executing, quote unquote, when we are producing like visuals and doing research and so on. But the core of the deliverables of a UX project are done by someone, let's say operations or software development and so on, right? So that means that if the team is stuck, the users don't get the experience that you envisioned, right? So what I've been preaching for the last 10 years of my career is that once the teams are stuck, you step up and help the teams get unstuck, right? It's a different kind of thinking. So as a designer, you need to stop thinking. I mean, at some point, you do need to get to things like mockups and pixels. But for you to grow these skills, you need to think a lot about other things like strategy and vision and facilitation, right? So if you're not going to have time to sit through the whole presentation, here's a summary of what we're going to be talking about today. So the stakeholder management, and to be honest, for many years I was very worried about this word stakeholder. I mean, especially the management part of stakeholder management, because it sounded like you're manipulating or managing people, right? So first, the issue number one is the management side of things. In a sense, let's say you might not be their manager, or might be the other way around. They are your manager, right? So you might have a boss who is a stakeholder. You might have a product manager who is a stakeholder, especially if you're working in the software industry. Some roles are very well established already, things like product manager, product owner, and so on, right? So how do you manage someone that you're not their manager, right? So I think that for many years I struggle with that word itself, right? The second thing is management sounded like there's a degree of manipulation, right? But then what I came to learn through a lot of trial and error is that it's not so much about managing, but it's more influencing, right? And we've been talking throughout the series that for designers to drive product vision forward, you need to be able to influence the decisions for the benefit of the business, for the benefit of the users, and so on. Right? So It's a long way of saying that stakeholder management is about identifying who are the people, groups, or organizations that could impact your project or be impacted by the project, so that you can analyze what are their expectations, and because people have their expectations, what these expectations, how these expectations might impact your project, right? And once you identify these people and you understand their expectations, then you develop a strategy of how you're going to engage with them so that decisions and executions run as smooth as possible, right? So with that said, there's quite a lot of methods and tools and practices there for that the PMI and other organizations recommend for stakeholder management. But regardless of what tools or practices you're going to use, it's very important to understand the correlation between the communication from a pure, let's say going back to the core of this series here, project management, communication for the purpose of status, um, from status for information, but also things like decision making and so on. So there's a strong correlation between how you communicate, but also how do you establish the relationship with your stakeholders, and probably more important than everything, how do you build trust with your stakeholders, right? So, and here's the thing that unfortunately we're not going to cover today, but if you go back to the facilitating decision making series, you're going to see my opinion in depth there. In the end of the day, our work only makes into a product if we can get stakeholders to commit, right? So that means the influencing and the management side of the stakeholder management is not an ends on it itself. What we want is to get people to commit, decide, commit, and then move on, in a sense of like take the action, right? So so in we got what we're gonna see in this series is this idea of and I mentioned several times already, it's not for the lack of ideas that people cannot innovate, right? Usually it's because they lack a shared vision or they lack a shared understanding of what the problems they're trying to solve. And I mentioned this many times in many other parts of this series. And usually we talked in the scope of the team, right? Say the team doesn't have a shared understanding of the vision, or they doesn't have a shared understanding of the problems we're trying to solve. In the in the scope of stakeholder management, what might happen is, best case scenario is the stakeholder has a strong understanding of the vision or the problem that they're trying to solve, and they are very efficient in communicating that vision and sharing that understanding of the problem, right? Unfortunately, some teams struggle with, let's say, maybe the stakeholders, they have a strong vision, it's just that they haven't been able to communicate to the team, right? And usually this is something that you as a strategist or a project manager, or sometimes even as a designer, I had to do it myself, right? Say for me to be able to work on the designs and try to create the experience that the users needed, I kind of have to extract the vision out of people's heads by interviewing and workshops and so on. But the worst case scenario is the stakeholder, him or herself, doesn't have a vision or doesn't have a good understanding of the problems they're trying to solve. So this is where you have to engage with them early, and you have to engage with them often, so that you kind of have to check this, right? So in this series, we're going to be talking about a lot of like how especially this episode, we're going to talk a lot about influencing, right? So that means you have to prod, encourage, guide, coach, ask questions, and so on. And so, um, yeah, so this is the definition that we were talking about in the beginning. So stakeholder management is about identifying the people, the groups, and the organizations that impact or could be impacted, right? So that means that from that perspective, you have internal stakeholders, right? So for example, if you are working on a Scrum team, you have things like your software developers are your stakeholders when they need something from you. Your product manager is a stakeholder when they need something from you, right? But on the other hand, you are a stakeholder on other parts of the process, right? So it's not so much about the title. And this is something that I think is really critical to understand. Stakeholder is not a title, right? So that means you look at someone's org chart, like you look at the org chart of your company and you see someone that has a title of vice president or director of something. They might be a stakeholder of your project, but we're going to be talking about soon that, let's say, there's a degree of like influence over your project from a perspective of, say, could they impact your project in a sense by, do they have a say, for example, on the decision? Or they could be impacted, and this is the other kind of stakeholder, right? They could be impacted by a project. For example, in that sense, your end users are stakeholders of your project because they are impacted by your project, right? So how do you get the voice in? How do you engage with your user as a stakeholder so that you understand their expectations and the impact on the project, right? So, but probably more important here, if you look at the definition, developing strategies for effectively engaging with stakeholders, right? So at the end of the day is not just about looking at the stakeholders as just pure decision makers, right? You have to engage them to influence the decisions. But probably what we want, not so much of probably, but what we want in the end is to drive the vision forward, right? So yeah, so, and this is the part that is the, and this is the part that I think is the hardest of this whole project management journey here, is that it takes time for you to understand and develop a list of all the people that I have to engage, right? And I see a lot of people that just jump in. Let's say someone, especially I've seen junior designers come in and say, hey, my manager, like a product manager comes in and says, hey, we need to work on X, right? If you jump directly to the execution, well, I think we talked about it in the previous part of this series, right? Let's say facilitating decisions. Jumping to the solutions is probably the worst bias that you can incur in. But from let's say, forget the decision making part of it and jump into the solution. Just thinking from a pure project management perspective is, if you don't take the time to understand the stakeholders, you might not realize that there are people that are intentionally or unintentionally working on your behalf, speaking on your behalf, or intentionally, unintentionally trying to undermine your project, right? Because like they haven't been engaged, that they don't understand the nuances of your project, right? So you have to uncover who are these agents that are helping you drive success, right? And understand who can create trouble for your project, right? So if, let's say, if I guess this was a long way of saying, like, know who your stakeholders are and then get to know them, okay? And here's a couple of techniques that I'm gonna share with you. And I in other parts of this series, we were talking a lot about decision making, and one of the skills that we were talking about is visual thinking. Well, so we can use our own design thinking, visual thinking skills. Like one of the techniques that you could use is to just to map, put the stakeholders on a map. Some people call this a power map. Some people call this an influence map. But regardless, is this, you try to look at a couple of perspectives, right? So the first version of this diagram here, you have two axes that you're trying to map your stakeholders in. You have the influence, how these people can have an impact on ultimate decisions, and usually different stakeholders that have different kind of roles, right? Some people provide the resources, some people provide direction, Some people provide expertise, right? So it's not like you look at someone's title and then you know what kind of influence that they have. It's literally you have to spend the time interviewing people and understanding what kind of influence that they have, right? And then the other axis is interest. And here's something that, at least in my practice, I noticed that I cannot speak for every other role in, let's say, a Scrum team, but at least from the design side of things, this is not the kind of skills that you learn when you come out of school, right? So when you come out of school, you think, let's say, oh, because I've done and I understand how to interview users, I understand how to create prototypes, I understand how to, I understand like cognitive psychology theory, and I understand mental models. People, I mean, at least by the time that I graduated, I thought that if I knew how to design things, I would be able to produce enough information to influence the stakeholders, right? But when you're looking at perspectives like this, for example, especially the interest part, it has very little to do with the objective aspects of the design. It might end up being like how does this one project that you're working on plays on the bigger scheme of the other forces that are going on in the organization, right? So if you're a small startup and you let's say you are the only Scrum team on the company, then that relationship of, let's say, who are the different stakeholders, how much influence they have, and what interest they have in your project, that's usually very simple. But I've been working on enterprise software for the last 25 years, and the more complex the organization gets, and complex here could mean many things. Let's say sometimes it's large, sometimes is hierarchical, sometimes is distributed. But whenever the organization gets complex enough and the number of stakeholders grow, this interest axis of the equation here gets really fuzzy, right? So you have to have a good understanding of, let's say, spending time with the stakeholders and trying to map them. And let's look at what it means here. Right? So high interest and high influence is the quadrant on the upper right there. These are the people that has, as the name suggests, by the axis, like have the highest interest on your project and highest level of influence. And these people are the power players, right? And I know that a lot of companies they tend to have this they tend to have this concept like, oh, we are a very flat organization. Everybody, like, we have an open door policy, everybody comes in. But in practical terms, you know what this means, right? Say you might have an opinion on something, other people on your team might have an opinion on something, but the people that have high influence, they have a stake on the ultimate decision, right? So this group, you have to make sure that you have regular contact with them, and you should spend as much time, or at least enough time, to build a strong relationship with them. And you'll notice that they are the neutral, right? Usually, right? Let's say they are the people that that you most likely be working closely with, because they are, let's say, because they have a high influence, they most likely are connected to your project more closely. For example, a design manager, a product manager, right? But if you look at the lower left quadrant, which is the low influence and low interest, people tend to disregard these people because they think, oh, they have low influence and low interest, right? So these are the sleepers, right? So you may want to make information available to them, but compared to the others, you should not spend a lot of time on this group. Usually what I do is, like, if you're not into that kind of understanding the politics and the people dynamics of your company, and you think that this is an overkill, here's something that you might find useful to do a diagram like this. Is We talked in a previous episode of the series about design reviews and how to conduct design reviews and so on. Well, you could use your map um, for this kind of mapping the stakeholders to know, for example, who should be part of the design review, if nothing else, right? But if you are more like on the lead side of the user experience, when you're, let's say, producing designs and you need to communicate out the outcomes of your work to other people, then definitely a diagram like this will be very important for you to come up with a communication plan of keeping people up to date and so on. So now let's look at the at some other parts of this graph here. So the high influence and high interest, high influence and low interest is the group on the top left quadrant, right? So as you can see, they have they usually they start, especially if you are you've been successful in other projects and you've been assigned to that team. Usually they start with a positive attitude, or at least you would hope so, right? This is the this is what some authors call this the danger zone, because these are the stakeholders that if you don't treat them properly, they can threaten the success of your program, right? These are the groups that they don't tend to be highly engaged in the program. So for example, these are the people that you keep sending emails to them because you think they have a high influence on your project, but they don't respond. You try to ask them, invite them for meetings to review your work. They say, sorry, you're too busy. So because they might be distracted, right, by other things, like they have other initiatives in the company they need to spend time with. So um, you need to somehow find a way to reel them in so they can become a positive proponent of your program, right? So here are the two people that I think you really need to well, let's say looking at the two spots of the quadrant there, especially when you look at how the informants, which is the low influence and high interest, how the informants relates to the other two groups, right? I say the sleepers and the power players. So the low influence and high interest is a very interesting group because they they want to have a lot of information, right? Like they have high interest, but they might not have an influence on your program. Let's say they are not in your project, they are not necessarily have a specific decision making power into your project, but because they have a high interest, and they usually these people they have a lot of network influencing, then you want to definitely make sure that they are well informed about your project so that they can be an ally um, to your program. And I mean, if you're in the comments, start saying, I mean, I can understand that if you want to leave us some comments behind on this video about, let's say, power and allies and stuff like this, like even these words that kind of communicate things like a military kind of a view of the world. And I've seen people complain about things like allies, like we're using like war terminology to talk about projects. I understand that, and I understand this concern. I myself was very hesitant of looking at the world from this kind of lens, but I mean, I know this might sound a little bit simplistic, but regardless of what you think about let's say, oh, maybe we shouldn't look at things at power, we are a flat organization and so on, but the reality is these forces are all at play, right? I've been working on enterprise software for 25 years now, and I've worked in China, I worked in US, I worked in Germany now for 10 years. I've seen these same patterns everywhere, right? So and this is not something academic that I've read on a book. I mean, I'm referencing um, some frameworks from some authors, but I see these dynamics at play every day at work. And So the other way to look at this matrix of stakeholders, and I mean, this one that I just showed you is very good to help you come up with like a communication plan of how often should you you should inform these particular stakeholders on your project. The other one that's probably as important, but is a different kind of look at your project, is to look at the influence again, but in the other quadrant, look at the attitude towards your project, right? So the attitude towards your project is how committed people are to the success of your project, right? So let's look at some of the examples above, right? So the idea here is to rate each person based on influence on their project, but also rate them towards the commitment, right? So you draw someone on a grid here, right? So for example, let's look at the technical specialist here, which is the second row from the top, right? Let's say you mark an X so where they currently are, right? Well, using this quadrant here, let's say that you interview the technical specialist and you ask him or her a couple of questions, and you get a sense that they have an influence, a marginal influence on your project. And usually they cannot be influenced by you because technical specialists, they tend to be the domain experts. So that means it's not like you can change your mind. If the expert has an opinion based on an expert and in his expertise based on best practices or industry standards, it's not like you can change their mind, right? So that means you say that you have marginal influence. But then you look at the other quadrant there, it says they are generally positive around your project, right? So based on the degree of influence that they have on your project, you might want to come up with a plan of how do you move them from generally positive to wholly committed, right? So let's look at another row here, right? The quality assurance, you mark them in the beginning of the project with an X that says, well, they have equal influence to you in the project, and they're generally neutral in terms of commitment. They're not opposing, they're not committed. Then you have to decide, let's say, how much time do you want to spend influencing that row, right? So let's say you want to, let's say in this case here, just in the case of the example, the X overlaps with the circles, right? Which is like where do you want them to be? In this case here, when you're coming up with your communication plan, then you're deciding, or when you're thinking about your strategy of how much time do you want to spend with that stakeholder, you're generally acknowledging that you don't want to spend as much time as you want in the other roles. But look at the other ones, like internal team member. That person, whoever that is, an internal team member, could be like I don't know, project manager or program manager, a product owner, a software developer. They have significant influence over the project, and they can be influenced by you, right? So that's already positive. But they are generally opposed to your project. So that means you mark them with the X on the generally opposed. Then you need to come up with a plan on how you're going to move them from generally opposed to generally positive, right? And this is the part that, and again, going back to the whole language of war and politics and so on, right? If you're not comfortable with thinking, looking at your team, looking at your stakeholders in this case, I get it, right? Say maybe you're a designer, you just want to keep your heads down, you just want to focus on working on your Figma prototypes and so on. I get it. What I'm trying to say is that these forces are at play, regardless if you want to play the game or not. Of course, let's say in some companies or in some team cultures, in some organizations, these politics or these people dynamics tend to be stronger than others, right? So let's say in the ideal world, you have an organization that is very flat. They're focusing on listening a lot. So everybody gets to share their perspective. Everybody gets to provide their input to the final decision making process. But other cultures or other companies, and I don't want to generalize culture here as, let's say, a national culture like Chinese or Brazilian or German. I'm just talking, let's say, even within those cultures, you have like the company culture. Even within the company culture, you have the specific team cultures, right? So depending on the team culture, the success of a design might end up being on how well were you able to influence um, the the stakeholders. And here's something that I observed. Here's something that I observed that happens over and over. Is that it's not necessarily you are a more successful designer because you're able to have that kind of influence. Well, one could argue that you end up, let's say, define success based on the amount of designs that get to the door, right? Or let's say you had an original vision for the design and you yourself consider design successful because there was a small degree of changes to your design because you were able to influence. Regardless of what you consider success from that perspective, what I notice is, if nothing else, this idea of stakeholder management and influencing helps, if nothing else, to get the projects unstuck, right? I say a lot of designs don't even get to see daylight because we don't get, like, we get stuck on all this like back and forth with talking to people in the decision making process, right? So if you want to, so I guess it's a long way of saying that if you want to increase your chances that the design is going to go through the whole development life cycle and actually see daylight, you're going to have to engage with your stakeholders in one way or the other, right? Which brings me to roles and responsibilities, right? So what I notice in a lot of the projects that I worked in is that the decision making process gets stuck because we are lacking clarity around of, like, what are the decision rights, and I'm using air quotes here again because looking at a lot of companies, they claim that that we are a flat organization and so on, but for practical, like, for practical purposes, that means whenever organization gets large enough, there's a degree of back and forth of, like, getting things like sign-offs and approvals and so on, right? So clarifying these decision rights, designing the information flows, right? Let's say, so for example, if for a decision to be made, information needs to go from one team to another team or from one department to the other. So how that information is going to flow? Aligning the motivators and making changes to the structure if those decision, like, if those roles and responsibilities are not clear, right? So if, while you may not be able to influence the organization as a whole, here's something that you can do at least for your own project, which is you need to have 100% clarity to the best of your abilities of who owns each decision. And again, some companies say, like, no, we are a very flat organization, but in the end of the day, someone owns the decision because, like, who's going to be accountable for that decision later? Makes a lot of difference of level of commitment that you're going to get. Who owns each decision? Who must provide the input? Who's ultimately accountable for the results of that decision? And how the results are defined, right? So if you have clarity around these, again, is another layer on the top of those matrices that we were talking about. And we're going to go to another diagram that helps clarify all of this. But if you have clarity around these, you're gonna save a lot of your own time and your stakeholders' time later when you're just, like, going back and forth and people get stuck on the decision making process, right? So, and again, a good decision is about assigning clear roles and responsibilities, right? And usually, I mean, the literature is pointing that the most successful companies, they have some sort of very simple set of tools to help them recognize what are the bottlenecks on the decision making process and think through about all these like decision roles and responsibilities that come every time you like the business change. And there's many changes coming to the business, right? So there are things like, for example, reorg. If you are working on an enterprise software company or on a company that is larger than, let's say, I don't know, 100 people, you're probably familiar with this word reorg, right? Say that like someone in the leadership leaves, or maybe the business environment changed, like an acquisition comes, and there's a lot of shuffling on the organization, no, like in the org chart of the company. So having clarity around these roles, every time that the business changes, it speeds up the decision making process, because instead of having to figure out again, like having to have all these negotiations around roles and responsibilities again, people know who to reach out to in terms of input, in terms of decision. Um, one of these tools that you can use to kind of clarify these roles and responsibilities is a RACI matrix, right? RACI is an acronym for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, right? So this RACI chart is basically, again, looking at the two quadrants again, is trying to map people in two axes, right? Let's say a responsibility versus assignment kind of matrix, right? Which helps you outline the roles and responsibilities in various phases of the. I mean, I've seen that done in a couple of ways, right? Let's say I've seen it done in terms of the the phase of the project. Let's say who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed in different phases of the project, versus um, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed with regards to a specific artifact on the company, right? So the artifacts one, I think it will be very, very strong, very reminiscent of the time that we used to do these waterfall processes, right? So like you have this really big bang kind of planning in the beginning, and then people work for many months, and then there's a phase where we do check-ins and we do approvals. So you have things like, for example, product requirements documents or PRDs, and then there's a who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed, and so on. Then you have like the next phase, the specification phase, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed, and so on. With us moving towards this agile methods, the one that I think is probably more useful is to think about, and I think that's the spirit of the all the stuff that we've been talking about. It's not so much about the output, but more about the outcome, right? So for example, looking at some of the stuff there, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed when setting a product vision, or defining the objectives and key results, or producing the product strategy and roadmap, right? So you're looking at different phases of the project, and you're looking at specific outcomes of that phase. I personally find that one a lot more useful, right? So the idea here is that this helps you in a lot of clarity in terms of, let's say, especially if the organization get complex, right? Let's say I've been working for the last 25 years in enterprise software, and I noticed that like as the projects get more visibility, there's a lot more stakeholders involved. And you could have at any given time, you could have like a mailing list of people related to a project that could be 20, 30 people. Are they all responsible? Are they all accountable? Do they all need to be consulted? You know, like it can get really tricky in terms of the amount of people that has to be in the loop. And designers, I think, and if you think about the design review aspect of this, let's say you finish quote unquote your design. Who needs to review this? Well, if you don't have a RACI like this, it can get really tricky, right? Because then there's like 20 people offer their opinion on a design. Who do you need to listen, quote unquote, in a sense of, let's say, is there a specific role or specific stakeholder that you should take their opinion stronger in consideration, right? Going back to that matrix again of, let's say, influence versus interest, right? And even that matrix of influence versus interest kind of shifts based on the specific phase of the project, right? Let's say, for example, your VP of design might be responsible for setting the vision, right? But when it comes to a specific implementation, let's say the team has 3 options and they choose one because it's the most feasible. It's not like the VP of design might have an influence over that, right? Let's say he or she has to defer to the team that is implementing, right? So here's a word of advice though. I noticed that while RACI tends to be very useful, there are not a lot of teams that are using it, right? So if you show up on Monday to your project team and says, hey, and you ask them like, hey, where's our RACI matrix? 9 out of 10 times, I'm gonna guess that you're not gonna find one, right? So it takes a very strong project management practice in your organization to have something defined up front, right? Say, which brings us back to the whole thing of, if you don't have one, do you want to step up to the plate and encourage the team to create one? Is it gonna be helpful for them, and so on, right? So there's this, and here's another thing that's even more tricky is like sometimes a team doesn't have a RACI like this because we just don't have the project management skills in house to do it. Like some teams don't even realize how useful something like this would be. The other part that's a little bit trickier is we know that these are good practices, but we can't be bothered, either because people think that this is going to slow us down to have all these discussions, or, and this is something that is kind of very delicate conversation to be had, is like some people just don't want this because the moment that they clarify their role, they might end up realizing that they are left out because they are not responsible. They are not consulted, right? So they want to be involved. They want to have a say on your project. And a RACI like this might actually clarify that they don't have a saying, at least the way that they perceive as saying on your project, right? So still worth trying anyway. So the other part that I think is very close to my heart, because I mentioned a few times already, I've lived in many countries now. I'm originally from Brazil, but I lived and worked in US, then I lived and worked in China, and I lived and worked in, now I'm currently in Germany. One thing that I notice is the cultural aspects of decision making, right? So going back to understanding the relationship of your stakeholders is not so much, again, it's not so much about their title. There's a degree of understanding the culture of the team, right? So understanding the cultural principles will give you an understanding of when, what, and how to influence in order to drive the decision, right? So, and I'm gonna give some examples here of, let's say, just this one this one aspect of decision making that I think tends to be very particularly tricky if you're working on an international multicultural team, right? So some cultures tend to be, or at least not, and I'm using the word culture here very generally, very generically. A lot of people tend to kind of look at the world from these kind of two extremes. Let's say either decisions should be consensual or decisions should be top down, right? And Professor Ari Meyer, that came up with this framework called the culture map, she's been very good at communicating using the framework to communicate and bring people the awareness of the differences between the way that people, and she has like 9 aspects of collaboration: deciding, persuading, influencing, and so on. And she basically, she's stating that one aspect is not better than the other, right? So for example, consensual is not necessarily better than top down and vice versa. It's just that it's different, right? And usually what happens is if you are operating in one culture that tends to be consensual, and let's give us an example here. Um, and again, I see a lot of people have problems with Eremaya's cultural map because they think it's a little bit it ends up creating stereotypes about culture. But I'm just going to use it as an example here, right? Let's say Erin Meyer, she did this research on working with a lot of companies in her consultancy, and she would say she usually have this idea of spectrums, right? So for example, consensual cultures, and she gives a couple examples there: Japan, Sweden, and Netherlands. These cultures in general tend to use more like consensual decision making processes, while cultures like India, Nigeria, Russia, China tend to be more top down, right? You may find this is stereotypical. You yourself, if you are from any of these cultures, you don't want to be put yourself in a box. But for practical reasons, like based on my based on my own observation, I mean, going through her framework, I can definitely identify with a lot of the findings that she has on her research when it comes to my own culture, the Brazil culture. Me having lived in China, in US, and in Germany, now I see a lot of correlations between her findings and some of the how the teams operate on the ground. But regardless of the stereotype, one thing I think is important, especially when it comes to decision making here, and especially when it comes to kind of working with your stakeholders, is this: if you are in a multicultural team, these cultural differences, especially when these differences collide, people tend to respond very emotionally, right? So if you come from a culture that you tend to operate from a top-down perspective, you might perceive as this other perspective of conversation. This takes too long. Why don't the manager doesn't the manager just decides, right? Let's say the top down, right? Which is like whatever culture you come from, whatever kind of perspective you have on the world, you tend to prefer or be more comfortable with that approach, and then kind of call the others worse, right? And again, there's no better or worse here, right? Vice versa, right? Let's say if you're coming from a culture that tends to be more the consensual, and then a stakeholder, like a strong stakeholder, come up and communicates a decision, and even if that person is not using those words, basically it's just saying I decided, right? If you're coming from a consensual background, you tend to be like, why was I not heard, and so on, right? So I guess I hope you get what I mean. It's like, if you look at the world from that perspective, you tend to consider the other perspective as worse. And here's the thing that I mean, every time I present the Eremaya's framework to people that kind of tend to resist to this stereotypical perspective, is this: once you're confronted with the framework like this, you might find it stereotypical, but what happens is, in your day-to-day, in your regular life, you don't even realize that you're thinking in such ways, right? So I mean, if nothing else, I think a framework like this is usually useful to keep your own biases of the ways of you look at the world in check, right? So here's another. We talked a little bit about decision making and so on, but when it comes to influence, I think the other part that we cannot really help talking about it is the idea of building trust, right? A lot, and I mean, I hope I'm not sounding a little bit simplistic here, but all the challenges that I mentioned before, back and forth with decision making, unclarity of roles and responsibilities, and so on. At the larger company, maybe they could be a big issue, but if when it comes to your own interaction with your team members and your stakeholders, most of these problems go away if you're just able to build the trust with people, right? Because like once people trust each other, they can engage in the conversations that help untangle all these problems, right? So basically, the single most important thing that you can do to improve your relation, like your collaboration with the stakeholders, is to focus on those relationships, like create trust, and establish rapport, right? So, and here's something that I mean, Tom Griever, who wrote the book Articulating Design Decisions, he has a very strong kind of controversial idea, but I cannot help but agree, is we as designers, we tend to claim that we are the people that understand our users. We have skills like empathy and so on. My experience is, and I think Tom Griever's experience is like we tend to empathize a lot with the end users, but we don't empathize with the people inside our internal stakeholders, right? Let's say development teams are stuck with it. Like they ask questions about our specs. Like the first reaction we have is like we kind of, let's say, yeah, answer questions again and so on. Or the stakeholder asks us to change something on the design. Yeah, like I like your design, but please change this or that. It's like you have that reaction, like why do you asking to change it again? You know what I mean? So I I guess what Tom Grievous tried to say is like the same skills that we have for empathizing with the end users, we should be using to empathize with the internal stakeholders, right? So one way to look at this is a framework that I find it very intriguing. I came in contact a couple years ago. It's called the trusted advisor. And because I've been working in the software industry, I'm surrounded by people that have to have this very analytical way of looking at the world. Every time I show a formula, and that's why I like this framework so much. Every time I show a formula, it tends to intrigue and get their interest spiked. So basically, the people that came up with the framework, Charles H. Green and his colleagues, they're saying that if you want to build trust with your stakeholders, there's four components to trust, right? So your credibility, your reliability, your intimacy, and your self-orientation, right? And let's go into the each one of them, right? So credibility, I hope it's kind of self-explanatory. Let's say you got to the place that you are in a project because you have some degree of credibility. If nothing else, is like you you have a title on it, right? Let's say you are the UX designer of the project, right? Um, Unfortunately, that credibility or like all these things, credibility, reliability, and intimacy, and self-orientation, either they come like there's some that come in when you're first assigned in because people heard about you in the past, or maybe like they have some expectations, like because you are the UX designer of this project, I'm assuming that you're credible, right? Some of this you have like some baggage that comes with you, hopefully positive. But what happens is like sometimes you come with a baggage that is negative, or you come with no baggage at all, and then you kind of have to build in, right? So for example, your credibility. What kinds of questions you ask in each meeting? Do people perceive you as an expert on your field, and so on, right? So that's your credibility. Your reliability is something that you need to build over time. Let's say every deadline, every task that people give you, do you deliver on time? Do you deliver ahead of time? Do you deliver late? Can people rely on you, right? So those two, I think, are kind of the most what people those two aspects of the trust advisor equation. I think people can, in every work culture, people can understand, right? Say this is what we call professionalism. You're credible because you have some expertise, some experience, and you're reliable because you are, let's say, for the lack of a better word, you're a good worker. The other two, intimacy and self-orientation, these are the ones that it's a little bit on the, actually a lot more on the soft skill side of things, and something that people tend to disregard in the or maybe not disregard, but they don't tend to pay such a strong attention on the day-to-day work. Is like intimacy is how much time have you spent with that person? If we never met, right? If you just stop a random person on the street and some random person on the street give you some advice, my gut feeling tells me that unless that person spent a lot of times like, I can give you this advice because I'm a doctor or blah blah blah, and then they explain what their credentials is, you might take their advice in, right? But in most cases is no matter your credentials are, if your the amount, like if you don't know that person, you're gonna take that advice with a grain of salt, right? So that's already a big aspect of the building trust. If you want to build trust with your stakeholders, you cannot help but spend time with them. Again, going back to the whole dynamic, some people think that this is artificial, kind of being nice to each other, but it's just I mean, looking at the cultures that I lived in, is I'm more likely to listen to people that I have had coffee with, that I understand where they are from. Oh, you also have kids like me, that, you know, like, so you understand a little bit of how my world is. So this comes with intimacy. The part that I think that is the hardest to explain is this self-orientation, right? Self-orientation is about what is the agenda of that person? Does that person cares about me or cares only about them, right? So, and I don't want to go on the controversial side of things, but looking at the kind of divide that we have, like political divides that we're seeing everywhere, and the kind of general skepticism that we have against experts, right? So look at issues like climate change and so on. A lot of people that we used to perceive as very credible and reliable, like for example the experts and the scientists, somehow there's quite a lot of skepticism towards them. And usually I think, let's say if you go and ask, there's a degree of, let's say, yeah, but those people are paid by the lobbies, or these people have their own agendas. This is where I think there's a lot of skepticism coming towards some of the experts, because people don't understand like what are their agendas behind, right? Say, is someone paying for their research? Is someone paying for their opinions, right? I mean, stopping, like, let's drop the politics for a second, just speaking of your day-to-day of work, right? Say if the stakeholders believe you're credible, you have a track record of delivering things on time with high quality, and they understand who you are as a person, that's the intimacy. So the next thing that now you kind of have to focus on is the self-orientation, right? That means, are you there to serve them, or are you there to just get stuff for you, right? So you're influencing the decisions at the expense of their needs, right? So, I mean, we're not going to have time to talk about it now, but there are a couple of other relationship building philosophies, like things like the servant leader that I refer to. I'm going to share some articles towards the end of this presentation that we're going to be able to, that you're going to be able to check, like how do you make sure that you communicate the self-orientation really well. So, and we're almost over, but here's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. I'd say, so credibility, reliability, intimacy, and self-orientation are very abstract components of relationship building. So here are some very practical steps that you can take, like some 5 steps that will help you build your credibility, reliability, your intimacy, and your self-orientation with your stakeholders. Basically is, and here's my observation, these 5 principles will work in every culture. Do what you say and say what you're going to do, right? You promise someone something, you make sure that you deliver on that promise, right? And when in the process of delivering on that promise, you try to match what you're doing to the thing that you say that you were going to do, right? Let's say, and 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 for example, right? If you have a very aggressive goal that was established by the stakeholder, right? Um, and you feel that you're not going to be able to deliver, then you might communicate. Let's say instead of committing, yes, I'm going to do it, and then you deliver less, then you might want to negotiate the goal with your stakeholder, right? So if a goal is too aggressive to deliver to begin with, you might discuss that up front instead of disappointing the stakeholder later. Because here's what I observed in a lot of coaches that I work with is like most stakeholders would not think from the perspective of, yeah, I gave them an impossible goal and it's okay if they deliver half of what I said. Well, some stakeholders are compassionate enough and then they know that some of their goals are aggressive, but you might adjust their expectations up front, right? So the second thing is try to make sure there are no surprises, right? So nothing derails a relationship like surprise. So if something needs to be asked, like something in your project is giving you a sense that it might escalate because like you might run into trouble, don't wait for that thing to blow up. Bring it up front, right? So you don't want to also like you don't want to overreact either and you just escalate everything. But I guess you get what I mean, right? I say try to make sure that there are no surprises, right? The third thing is, and this works in a lot of cultures, and this is a very strong kind of helps you build your negotiation skills, is like you try to build a mutually beneficial business relationship, right? Some things you do for the benefit of your project. There's a tight connection um, to your project. Let's say I'm doing this because this will push the project on the long run. But some things you do it just because it's the right thing to do, right? Let's say I don't want to get too philosophical, right? Let's say, but like think about some of the golden rules, like the golden rule from Jesus, right? Do to others what you would like to be done to you, right? So whatever you can do to pay it forward, even if it doesn't come around and helps you in the end, it just goes in a long ways of building your reputation, right? So the other thing to remember is like stakeholders are people too, right? Especially customers and executives, right? So whoever you interact with in your company, like a janitor, an assistant, like middle level manager, even the CEO of a company, you treat everyone as a human being. You understand, let's say, sometimes they are very responsive to your emails, sometimes they're not. Well, it's not because they are generally not caring about your project. It might be that there's something going on in their life, right? So don't, like, if you ask a couple of times, don't push it. Maybe there's a different way to engage with your stakeholders that it just happens that in the moment that you're trying to engage with them is not helping, right? Which kind of leads to the second, like the last point, always show respect, right? Even the people that you think that they don't have an influence on your project, even the people that don't no don't necessarily, you think that they might not have something to add to your project, either because you think you don't perceive them as an expertise. More often than not, especially if you're a consultant, you're jumping from project to project, the people that you're going to be interacting with, they've been there longer on that project or in that on that environment. So you can always learn something by listening to people, right? And I'm afraid we're gonna have to move on to the next stuff. But here's the last piece of advice that I want to work with is this: that in the end of the day, all that we want is to drive product vision forward, right? So so that means that without commitment, whatever advice or whatever influence you're trying to give is just an expression of your opinions, right? So a decision is not really made until resources are um, allocated to it, right? So thinking and doing is very different, right? So in the end of the day, all you want from a stakeholder management perspective, and maybe all you want is a little stronger word, but you get what I mean, right? Say you want to work with your stakeholders, you want to understand their needs, you want to um, address their concerns, but what we want in the end is commitment. We want to make a decision, commit to that decision, and move on, right? Which brings us to the thing about action, right? So without action, the value of a decision cannot be realized, right? So you're trying to work on those amazing designs that you think are going to create a awesome user experience. If people don't act on it, nothing's going to happen. So that how do you do it, right? So here's a couple of things that you can think of when it comes to getting people to commit to action. And if you've seen some of my references there, when it comes to asking questions, I hear you're probably seeing some of my favorite questions I get, but here's a few others, right? Um, Towards the end of every decision point, when you've engaged with your stakeholders and you think that we are ready to decide and commit, just ask a few simple questions, right? What is it going to get in the way of getting this done? Um, what do we intend to do about it? Who needs to be brought in the loop, right? Especially if, let's say, we're designing something, should someone else be here that is not here yet? That person might end up being kind of a roadblock later. Who should be doing what part of the execution here? What information do we need? When do we check in? What are the deadlines? So this is the kind of stuff that's going to help, is going to go long ways into making sure that when we decide, people commit, and then we are able to execute. Right. So I know that this was a lot of information to share. I've added, I've you're gonna be able to see more information about this on the link. If you kind of like the this kind of information, yeah, I'm sharing a lot of on design strategy and user experience design and project management. You can check me, follow me on social media. You can also check this link there if you want to know more about um, if you want to know more about project management. So just to recap here, right? So again, stakeholder management is about identifying the groups that are impacted and or impact or can be impacted by your projects, right? And doing great stakeholder management involves understanding the relationships and in building trust. And what we want in the end is to get people to commit. So thanks everybody. This was the last episode on this 5-part series on project management. So today we talked about communication and stakeholder management. If you check the description of this video below, you're gonna see the links to the other parts of this series. Or if you missed any of these, I want to encourage you. So again, thanks everyone for participating. If you have any questions, you feel free to drop me a comment there on my social media or add some comments to the video below. I really hope to see you in the future. Bye bye.